Hello and welcome to Media Decoded. In this video, we're going to look at the coronavirus, this pandemic, and we're going to evaluate the facts, and we're going to leave it to you after giving you all the facts, whether or not you think this came from a lab or whether you think it was a naturally occurring event. I think the evidence is all lopsided and one-sided, and we're going to present it to you. So without further ado, here we go. Look, most of us are trapped at home, and most of us are paying at least some attention to the news. I mean, there's so many questions we all have, and yet finding answers seems to be difficult. Well, weeks ago, I started hearing snippets about China and what their involvement might be in all this. But then nothing. A 2-minute segment on CNN, a 4-minute segment on Fox, and then nothing. No serious China coverage regarding their culpability, and I wondered why this was. It led me to do my own research. I was shocked to see what damning factual information is available all over the internet. Shocked to see the extent of China's cover-up, and even more shocked to see that the WHO, the World Health Organization, our own mass media, and the global scientific community were all eager to squash any theory that involved the truth. And this video is the result of what I've uncovered. I'll be exploring evidence which suggests that the coronavirus came from a viral lab in China, that China silenced whistleblowers and murdered hundreds and maybe thousands of its own citizens, and that China set this pandemic unto the world intentionally. I will first explore separate facts which are clues, puzzle pieces if you will, which when all put together point to one very scary conclusion. I will use math, statistics, and probability to look at the odds of this crisis being a naturally occurring event. Well, let's get started by taking a look at the two most glaring facts regarding the start of the outbreak. Fact one, the virus started in Wuhan, China. So the current global scientific consensus is that this virus started from a wet market in Wuhan, China. And since this is said to be the case, let's take a look at wet markets, what they are and where they exist. Now we can start by checking out an article from NPR titled, "Why They're Called Wet Markets and What Health Risks They Might Pose." The article goes on to read, patients who came down with the disease at the end of December all had connections to the Hunan seafood market in Wuhan, China, the complex of stalls selling live fish, meat, and wild animals known as a wet market. Researchers believe the new virus probably mutated from a coronavirus common in animals and jumped over to humans in the Wuhan bazaar. Now remember that quote regarding all patients having a connection to the wet market, as we'll come back to that later? But for now, we want to simply ask the question, assuming that this virus did come from a wet market, what are the odds of the virus starting in any single wet market in the world? And in order to find this out, we first need to explore roughly how many wet markets there are around the globe. Now, here is an article regarding the numerous wet markets that exist in China alone. The article is published by the National Review and it's titled, "The Chinese Wild Animal Industry and Wet Markets Must Go." The article reads, while thousands of such wet markets have been closed, how did we get to 2020 with such practices in a city larger than the largest U.S. city? Now they're referring to Hong Kong here. But we can see from this data point that thousands of wet markets were in fact closed in China alone after the SARS epidemic in 2008. How many stayed open? How many others all over the world were never closed and remain open? Wet markets exist in nearly every country, from Mexico to Greece to all of Asia, Taiwan, Singapore, Thailand, China, and many others, including the United States. It's estimated that there are roughly 50 in New York City alone. Therefore, it is very safe to assume that there are at least 1,000 wet markets all over the world. Truth is, that number is probably 20 times greater than our estimation. But being generous, let's use the model that there are 1,000 wet markets all over the world. So if this is true, the virus did in fact start in a wet market, and we can assume that there are over 1,000 wet markets in the world, then the odds of any one wet market being responsible are exactly 1 in 1,000. Well, since it started in a wet market, any random wet market would meet that criteria, 1 in 1,000. So this, in and of itself, is not extraordinary. But when we look at fact number 2, things start to change. Fact number 2. In all of China, there is only one level 4 viral lab, and it's in Wuhan. Now, what is a level 4 viral lab? Well, it's a viral lab that has top security protocols and is responsible for handling the most deadly and contagious viruses. And we can see here from an article published by Live Science It's titled, "Only One Lab in China Can Safely Handle the New Coronavirus." And it goes on to read, although China intends to build 5 to 7 high containment laboratories by 2025, as of now, only the Wuhan lab can currently contain pathogens of this nature. This according to the 2019 CDC report. Now, it's important to note that this report came out before the crisis began. And also a quick note, notice that they said that is the only viral lab that could handle such deadly pathogens. Just keep that in mind. We'll get back to it later. Well, the fact is that Wuhan, China is the world's epicenter for virus testing and manipulation. And it has been known for about 40 years, I'd say. I mean, in 1981, a nationally best-selling author named Dinar Kuntz wrote about a virus escaping from a lab in China called the Wuhan 400. He used Wuhan as its epicenter because it made sense to. Now, I bring up Kuntz only to highlight the fact that the lab in Wuhan has been the world's lead in viral studies for a generation. And it has been public knowledge, so much so that science fiction authors used it as fodder for their stories. So now, when we couple this fact, the fact that the only viral facility handling these types of viruses is in Wuhan, with fact number 1, that the virus epicenter is in Wuhan, then the odds of this being a naturally occurring event out of the Wuhan wet market is over 1 in 1,000. But this isn't all. When we introduce fact number 3 to this equation, the odds jump tremendously. Fact number 3. The 34-year-old Chinese scientist Li Wenliang died of COVID-19. Now, Dr. Li worked in the lab in Wuhan and was the first whistleblower as to the existence of COVID-19. He was the first to publicly signal that the coronavirus existed. He immediately sent out an email to his brethren and colleagues to warn them of the coming danger. We'll get into that later. For now, let's just explore the fact that he died of the virus and was just 34 years old. Here is an article regarding his death published by NPR on February 6th, titled, "Coronavirus Whistleblower Dies from the Disease in China." In the article, it states, a Chinese doctor who was among the first to blow the whistle on the new coronavirus has died from the disease. The hospital treating him said on social media early Friday local time. Now, let's take a look at the odds of a 34-year-old dying naturally of the coronavirus. Here is a chart published by worldometer.com. Many of you are familiar with this site as you are following the data of the current epidemic. And here we can see on this site that they have charts that break deaths down to other factors such as pre-existing conditions. But on this chart, it's an age chart and it doesn't take any of those factors into account. It is simply the raw data of all people 30 to 39 dying of the virus. As you can see, it's 0.02%. Now, assuming that at least half of these 30-somethings died because of pre-existing health problems, and let's face it, the number is probably much more than that, we can be generous and say it's half, and that would mean that 1 in 1,000 30-somethings that catch the coronavirus die of it. Did the whistleblower die from corona, or did the Chinese government end him because he knew too much? Well, we know from the data that there is a 1 in 1,000 chance he died of the corona. And that leaves a 999 in 1,000 chance that the government silenced him permanently. Now, couple this with the fact that we have a 1 in 1,000 likelihood of it coincidentally starting in a wet market in Wuhan, and now you have quite literally a 1 in 1 million chance that these two events would occur in any realm of reality. 1 in a million. Now, let's dig a little deeper into Dr. Li Wenliang's story. Fact number 4. The scientist who died of the coronavirus was its first whistleblower. And we can start by looking at a New York Times article titled, "Chinese Bioethicists Silencing Doctor Impeded Early Control of Coronavirus." Now, in that article, it goes on to state that the doctor contacted his colleagues via a chat app saying, "The latest news is that the coronavirus infection has been confirmed and the virus typing is underway. Don't spread the word outside our group. Let your family and loved ones take precautions." A screenshot of the group chat was uploaded to a public website and spread, and this is how Dr. Li became the epidemic's whistleblower. Now, the doctor was arrested for this, forced to recant his statements and basically say that he was lying, and then a short time later, he died. So one doctor down, silenced, dead, leads us to fact number 5. A second whistleblower in China went missing. We can see here from an article in the New York Post that Dr. Li wasn't the only scientist to go missing. The article is titled "Whistleblowing Coronavirus Doctor Mysteriously Vanishes." You can also see that 60 Minutes of Australia did a segment on the story as well. I'll show that to you now.
As China now tries to rewrite history and claim it was transparent all along, a final nail in the coffin of their lie. Just 2 weeks ago, the head of emergency at Wuhan Central Hospital, Dr. Ai Fen, also went public, saying authorities had stopped her and her colleagues from warning the world. She has now disappeared, whereabouts unknown.
All right, so we have 2 doctors down. I wonder what could be next. Let's see. Fact number 6. A Chinese journalist who reported on the silencing of the 2 Chinese scientists went missing. Jesus. I mean, everybody's gone missing. Everybody. This is insane. So we can read here in an article published by The Guardian titled "Coronavirus. Journalist missing in Wuhan as anger towards Chinese authorities grows." Now, the article goes on to report that Chen Qishi, a human rights advocate, has been missing since Thursday, the same day Li Wenliang, who was punished by authorities for trying to warn colleagues and friends about the new SARS-like virus, was first reported to have died from the coronavirus. And it appears that Chen went to visit a local hospital on Thursday, and friends and family have not been able to reach him since Thursday evening. The article reads, Chen, who has more than 200,000 followers on Twitter and more than 400 subscribers on his YouTube channel, had been posting regular updates from Wuhan, where he visited hospitals and spoke to patients and doctors. One of the last communications from Chen read, "I'm afraid. In front of me is disease. Behind me is China's legal and administrative power. But as long as I am alive, I will speak about what I have seen and what I have heard. I am not afraid of dying. Why should I be afraid of you, Communist Party?" And Chen has not been heard from since. Fact number 7. China destroyed lab samples of the coronavirus in December of 2019. The National Review published the following article titled, "Chinese authorities gagged laboratories in December over coronavirus SARS connection." The article goes on to read, Cakes and Global, a respected independent publication, reported that genomics laboratories sequenced the coronavirus by December 27th, but were ordered by local and national officials to hand over or destroy the samples and not release their findings. 60 Minutes did a piece on this, so let's take a look at that.
A respected independent newspaper based in Beijing, which uncovered shocking behaviour by Chinese government officials. It reported that testing labs that had cracked the code and identified the mystery flu as a new coronavirus strain were ordered to hand over or destroy their samples. They were not allowed to release their findings.
So in December, the Chinese knew all about the virus, yet didn't tell anyone about it and silenced those who did. The Chinese government is freaking scary as hell. Some of their other moves? Fact number 8. The Chinese government facilitated the spread of the virus. As of January 7th, the Chinese knew that this disease could be spread human to human and that Wuhan was the center of the epidemic. Yet they encouraged their citizens to take part in the Chinese New Year festival in Wuhan. When the festival was over, 5 million people fled Wuhan for countries all over the world. 500,000 left for the United States. All of these facts can be read in an article by the Business Insider titled 5 million people left Wuhan before China quarantined the city to contain the coronavirus outbreak. But you can also check out 60 Minutes because they did a piece on this topic.
The truth is, the epidemic was doubling in size weekly, and China knew it was being spread by human contact. It's just the rest of the world was kept in the dark.
Inside Wuhan, the people knew what was going on. Everybody was seeing the bodies being pulled out of apartments and the ailing just completely out of it on gurneys being carried off to mysterious hospitals all over the place.
From January 7, the next 12 days are critical as China's Great Lie continues alongside its inaction. Had China acted immediately instead of covering up, it's estimated that 95% of the eventual pandemic could have been prevented, but it didn't. It's not until January 20 that China reveals the real rate of infection. Instead of a total 40 cases, they're now reporting more than 400 a day. And they finally admit what they've hidden for weeks. The deadly virus is contagious between humans.
By then, catastrophe is looming, and January 25 is the official lunar holiday, the biggest holiday in all of China, arguably the single biggest holiday on Earth, because more human beings move about within China in anticipation of the lunar holiday than any other occasion of internal movement anywhere in the world.
During January, President Xi Jinping was well aware of how deadly the situation was. Yet he made a decision that would ultimately condemn the world. He allowed 5 million people to leave the epicentre of the virus, to leave Wuhan without being screened for COVID-19, before he decided to impose a lockdown.
So the government knew the exact nature of the virus and then encouraged its citizens to mass gather and then encouraged them to flee to the tune of 5 million people. I mean, remember, the population of Wuhan is only about 11 million. So they let half the population flee unscreened for the virus and sent them out into the world. And once they did flee, then the Chinese quarantined Wuhan immediately, which brings us to fact number 9. The Chinese government welded people into their homes and left them there to die. Now we get into some real nasty stuff. I mean, how many did they do this to? One could only guess. But looking at these videos, it sure makes you grateful that you weren't born in China.
把门洞都焊死了，不让出屋了。下一个就是我们6号楼了，这是我家了，焊死了。你想出来，就留一个小窗户送菜，还要付钱呢。
把门封的了，你看那个电焊工在那块焊的，看这样是消毒的。 哎，那个是门吗？才干的门哦。
把门封了。
把门封的了。你看那个电焊工在那块焊的，那中间是一个门，你看。然后这肯定是人妈的，你看这个病毒。
The Chinese government is to be congratulated for the extraordinary measures it has taken to contain the outbreak.
Okay, so that guy right there, he's the leader of the World Health Organization, congratulating China on the extreme measures that they were willing to go to contain the virus. Yep. I mean, welding people into their homes to die. Yeah, that's definitely an extreme measure, right? They are to be congratulated. Who is this clown? Well, let's take a look, because it's a perfect segue into fact number 10. The WHO lied for China and praised them for their transparency, amongst other things. Now, this next video I'm about to show takes place at the end of January, and by this time the outbreak in China is in full swing. How did the World Health Organization, who has doctors in China, not see the evidence before them? No probing, no questioning, no investigation whatsoever, because the slightest bit of sleuth work would have uncovered a can of worms for sure. But no, not only did they not investigate at all, they took China at face value and parroted their lies to the detriment of the world. All the while heaping praise on China for, of all things, their transparency. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Check it out.
The speed with which China detected the outbreak, isolated the virus, sequenced the genome, and shared it with WHO and the world are very impressive and beyond words. China is actually setting a new standard for outbreak response, and it's not an exaggeration.
Yeah, I definitely agree. They're setting a new standard. Welding people shut in their homes to die. They're definitely raising the bar on quarantine. No doubt about it.
I will praise China again and again.
Oh, of course you will. But it gets better. With full knowledge that this disease is spread human to human and that there is an outbreak in China, on February 11th, the World Health Organization recommends no restrictions of travel to and from China. Are you kidding?
There is no reason for measures that unnecessarily interfere with international travel and trade.
这些措施与世卫组织的建议严重不符。我们需要事实，而不是恐惧；我们需要科学，而不是 rumor。我们需要团结，而不是 stigma。
So did you get that last part? Stigma? So here they are, full well knowing they're sending a bunch of virally infected Chinese out into the world, and they're smashing other governments, claiming they're bigots and they don't want stigma. I mean, it's unbelievable. But let's get this straight. This organization, the WHO, which has been primarily funded by the United States over the years, is shilling for China. The organization designed to keep the world safe is doing the exact opposite. Actually, it's doing harm. It's almost completely unbelievable. But it doesn't stop there with this organization. If you weren't aware, there was a civil war in China in the late 1940s, and the result was Taiwan becoming a sovereign nation. Now, China refused to acknowledge this fact. To this day, does everything it can to flex its might over Taiwan in order to control it. Now, I bring this point up to show the influence that China has had over the WHO and how it goes much deeper than just parroting the lies of the Chinese propaganda. It's actually actionable, and the Taiwanese have suffered. Now, I want you to watch this closely. This is the World Health Organization, mind you. Watch their response to anything regarding Taiwan.
Would the WHO consider Taiwan's membership? Hello?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I couldn't hear your question.
Okay, yeah. Let me repeat the question.
No, that's okay. Let's move to another one then.
Right, because I'm actually curious on talking about Taiwan as well, on Taiwan's case.
We decided to give Dr. Alward another call to follow up.
And I just want to see if you can comment a bit on how Taiwan has done so far in terms of containing the virus.
Well, we've already talked about China, and when you look across all the different areas of China, they've actually all done quite a good job. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for inviting us to participate, and good luck as you go forward with the battle in Hong Kong.
To the people of Wuhan, it is recognized the world's in your debt, and when this disease finishes, hopefully we'll have the chance to thank the people of Wuhan for the role that they've played in it.
I mean, I'm kind of without words. I mean, the influence that China has over this organization is just, it's mind-boggling. And so when I started looking at their influence, I started to stir up a couple of other things regarding Chinese influence, and it brought me to fact number 11. China controls a world narrative regarding the Hong Kong revolt. Now, as many of you are aware, China is in bed with many of America's top companies, and most of our congressmen, while we're at it, right? And on that topic of China infiltrating our government via big business, I mean, that's a whole separate video, and I don't have time to open that Pandora's box. I mean, what I'd like to do right now is focus on their influence over companies like the NBA and Nike. Now, as you may recall, throughout 2019, Hong Kong was revolting. Students were protesting. There was violence in the streets, and people were actually dying. The last article I could find on the topic was written by the South China Post, and the title of the article reads, "More than fourfold surge in 2 months in number of students arrested." Now, this article is dated November 19th, 2019. And as the protests grew, Daryl Morey, the general manager of the Houston Rockets, an NBA team, sent out a tweet saying, "Stand for Hong Kong," and it was met with immediate scorn. The Chinese government had demanded that he immediately apologize, and he did. Here's his apology. You can check this out. It's a tweet. "I did not intend my tweet to cause any offense to Rockets fans and friends of mine in China. I was merely voicing one thought based on one interpretation of one complicated event. I have had a lot of opportunity since that tweet to hear and consider other perspectives." What other perspectives? The perspective of a murderous, barbaric, communist Chinese government? I mean, it's just unbelievable. Now think about this. A communist regime, a murderous one, suppressing its citizens, implementing so much power that they had this American with his tail between his legs apologizing to the communist Chinese government. But it didn't stop there. Fans began to show up at NBA games with signs that read, and you guessed it, "Stand for Hong Kong." Very American, right? To support those who are oppressed? Well, these fans, while sitting in an arena on American soil, expressing their right to free speech, were kicked out of the stadium. Think about that for a minute. That's the power of the Chinese government and their power to control the narrative. It's really some scary shit. And China's influence had even reached sports superstar LeBron James. You know LeBron James, the political activist who always scours America for every nuance of racism, regardless of how small. This guy who touts every t-shirt from Black Lives Matter to I Can't Breathe and always fighting for the oppressed. I mean, and this is a good thing. I'm not knocking him. This is a great thing, right? Well, concerning the worst civil rights violations on earth, save North Korea, LeBron James simply didn't have enough information to comment. Oh, the irony.
I felt like with this particular situation, it was something not only was I, not informed enough about, I just felt like it was something that not only myself or my teammates or our organization had enough information to even talk about it at that point in time, and we still feel the same way.
I will praise China again and again.
Just simply unbelievable, right? Unbelievable. So now I want to bring you back to the uprising. Remember the date of that last article, November 19th, the article that talked about the uprising growing fourfold, becoming bigger and bigger? Well, it's hard not to notice the timing, literally a couple weeks before the start of COVID. Shame we have heard nothing of these protests since. I mean, this when they dominated the news cycle for the 9 months prior, becoming a bigger and bigger story. One could only assume the protesters currently have bigger things to worry about, no? Now, am I suggesting that China unleashed the virus to cause its citizens to cut the crap and come back to Big Daddy, who has all the medicines and supplies they would need at this time? No, I'm not, but the timing sure is spicy. Look, I know we ran around a little here, but my goal was for you to see just how nasty this government is, and to understand that they are literally capable of anything. Nothing holds them back. They are a hive mind with no care whatsoever for civil liberties, and they are extremely patient. And this, folks, is a very dangerous combination. Perhaps you weren't aware of what else China has been up to over the last few years, but how about we move on to fact number 12. China has been working on genetically altering human beings. So aside from studying deadly viruses, they have been genetically altering humans. Why? Well, for starters, so they are immune to viruses. This stuff is right out of a sci-fi book. Incredible. And here's an article regarding their progress written in 2018 and published by NPR.org. The article is titled, "Chinese Scientist Says He's the First to Genetically Edit Babies." The article goes on to state that the scientist He Jiankui of Southern University of Science and Technology in Shenzhen, China, says he used human embryos modified with the gene editing technique CRISPR to create twin girls. Two beautiful little Chinese girls named Lulu and Nana came crying into the world as healthy as any other babies a few weeks ago, he claimed. Now, he says his team performed gene surgery on embryos created from their parents' sperm and eggs to protect them from HIV. So, to be clear, China is studying deadly contagious viruses and simultaneously working on gene editing to create humans who are immune to specific viruses? Sounds like a whole boatload of no good to me. And the funny thing here is, in the midst of the pandemic, with all this bad press regarding corona, the Chinese silenced the gene doctor, putting out a statement which essentially reads, "China is morally against this type of science." Now, no one's heard from him since. Here's an article talking about his silencing and arrest from ABC News titled, "Gene Editing Scientist Reportedly Missing." Now, in the article, you can read China's official statement. His research was extremely abominable in nature and violated Chinese laws and regulations and breached the science ethics bottom line. Yeah, okay. So you expect us to believe that this scientist who was making global news doing research on the latest of technologies for the last 5 to 10 years was doing it without the state's knowledge? There's no huge private science organization in China that operates without government knowledge. They knew damn well what he was doing, funded it, and only in this current mess of bad press did they suddenly arrest this guy and castigate his work. Not a good look to be messing with genetically altered human beings so that they're immune to viruses and also working on deadly viruses at the same time, that's for sure. But does anyone actually believe China has stopped either of these fields of study? Hardly. So now that we have a complete understanding of the Chinese government, let's go back to the original hypothesis that this virus came from a lab in China. Fact number 13. The first person hospitalized by COVID had no connection to the wet market. Now, about 30 minutes ago, I told you to take note regarding an article which conveyed that all of the first cases of corona had connections to the wet market in Wuhan. Well, as it turns out, this isn't true. It wasn't long before we started to hear reports which contradicted the official narrative of the virus coming from the Wuhan wet market. On January 27th, we get this information. An article in the Business Insider website reads, "A new report indicates that the deadly Chinese coronavirus may not actually have originated at a Wuhan wet market." The article goes on to have these large bullet points which state, a report published in the medical journal, The Lancet, found that of 41 cases of the virus in Wuhan, China, only 13 were linked to the market. So that means 28 of them had nothing to do with the market. And the researchers also found that the first hospitalized case was not linked to the market. Now, this is clearly pretty damning evidence against the narrative that this started in the Wuhan wet market. If it did, the vast majority, if not all cases, would have had connections to that market. So this brings us to fact number 14. There are actually 2 labs in China that study the coronavirus, and they're both near Wuhan. Now, this is an important fact. Remember earlier I cited that the CDC declared that the level 4 viral lab in Wuhan was the only lab in China that could handle such a deadly contagion virus? Well, it turns out that there's a second lab within miles of Wuhan's wet market, this one with much lower security standards. So maybe it didn't come from the top security lab after all, the famous level 4 viral lab in Wuhan. More likely, it came from the second lab in Wuhan, which is much less guarded. Now, keep in mind, both of these labs did studies on the horseshoe bat, specifically in the area of coronavirus strains. So we'll get more into that in a few moments. Reports of this less safe second lab are everywhere. I mean, there's everything from scientists leaking information regarding the corona study to job applications published in Chinese newspapers in Wuhan looking for researchers to study bats and the corona type viruses. At this point, rather than bore you with scores more articles, I figure I'd just show you a clip from Tucker Carlson. Now, like him or not, he's the only one I've seen on television thus far addressing the truth regarding this topic. Check it out.
February 6, scientists from the South China University of Technology uploaded a paper on the origins of coronavirus. Where did it come from? Well, this offers some clue. Keep in mind as you hear this that these findings come from Chinese scientists who work for a university that is controlled by the Chinese government. So whatever else they are, the views you're about to hear are probably not racist anti-Chinese propaganda. Here's what the paper says. First, the scientists confirm what scientists around the world have said they believe. The virus most likely came from an animal known as the intermediate horseshoe bat. Here's the striking thing. There are no known colonies of this bat within 900 kilometers of Wuhan, nor is there any evidence that they were sold in the Wuhan wet market, despite many claims in the American media to the contrary, including on this show, by the way. Last night we did a segment on wet markets, the one in Wuhan included, and suggested that this bat was sold there. But let's be clear. The only actual analysis of that question that we're aware of is in this paper. These scientists interviewed almost 60 people, 59 of them, who frequented the Wuhan wet market. They confirmed there were no horseshoe bats for sale there, period. So that raises the question, where did the virus-carrying bats come from? And the paper says this, quote, "We screened the area around the market and identified 2 laboratories conducting research on bat coronavirus. Within a few hundred yards of the wet market was something called the Wuhan Center for Disease Control and Prevention. According to public reports, the center used intermediate horseshoe bats for research. Then about 7 miles away was another facility. This one was called the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The Virology Institute also conducted research on intermediate horseshoe bats, the ones that were not sold at the wet market. South China University scientists concluded that the coronavirus pandemic, the one that people are dying from here, likely came from one of these 2 government labs in Wuhan. They noticed that a scientist at the Wuhan Center for Disease Control and Prevention had been exposed to the blood and urine of horseshoe bats. And they ended the paper this way, quote, "The killer coronavirus probably originated from a laboratory in Wuhan. Safety levels may need to be reinforced in high-risk biohazardous laboratories. Regulations may be taken to relocate these laboratories far away from city centers and other densely populated places." End quote. How's that for interesting? Now, this paper has been online for nearly 2 months, and so far it has been virtually ignored in this country. Almost nobody in American journalism has dared to write about it. The few who have were immediately attacked as dangerous conspiracy theorists. Instead of assessing what seemed like the rational conclusions presented in the Chinese paper, there was a spate of American news stories and academic research designed to show that the coronavirus absolutely could not have been engineered in a Chinese lab.
Keep in mind that when I saw this segment air, I was already 2 weeks into the creation of this video and my research. So everything he talked about, it felt obvious because it's what my research showed as well, especially his last point. His last point really stuck with me because it's exactly what I found. And that is, while doing my research, I kept coming across articles from the mainstream media and the global scientific community with headings like lab theory debunked or lab myth, etc. Of course, I felt compelled to read these articles, and all of them kept referencing the global scientific community and touting the same 4 basic arguments as proof positive that this did not come from a lab in Wuhan. It's only after reading these articles that I became completely convinced that the evidence pointed to exactly what they told me it did not point to. Here's what I found. Fact number 15. Arguments against the virus coming from a lab are weak. Since every one of the hundreds of articles from the global scientific community and the mainstream media used the same 4 talking points as proof the virus didn't escape from a lab, I'll bring one up for you and get to its talking points. Now here's an article from the New Scientist, and it kind of completely epitomizes what I'm seeing. So, did coronavirus come from a lab, right? And then they go on to say, you can see the subtitle here, no, the virus isn't a bioweapon. And that seems to be everything I'm looking at. They start out saying it wasn't leaked from a lab and here's proof, and then they go on to talk about how it's not bioengineered, and even those arguments are really weak. Let's check them out. So point 1 that they make here is that it is so effective at attaching to human cells that it had to be a result of natural selection. What? Okay, so to be clear, the proof you have it didn't escape from a lab is that it's super effective at attaching to human cells. First of all, even if it wasn't bioengineered, what does that have to do with the virus being studied and escaping from a lab? Just ridiculous. Makes no sense. Point 2. Since it's a genuinely new virus, there's no way it could have been engineered by humans. What? This is the most ridiculous and absurd argument I've ever heard in my life. If it were engineered, it would be by definition new. These are their arguments. They're real arguments. Point 3, it would be a bad bioweapon. Really? I mean, these points keep getting better and better. Now I know it didn't come from a lab because it would be a better bioweapon. I mean, their point's just getting worse and worse. First of all, it seems like a pretty damn good bioweapon to me, crippling economies all over the world. But this is aside from the fact that they seem to be arguing against bioengineering here, arguing that the death rate would be higher if it were engineered. That's your proof it didn't escape from a lab? Remember that you're trying to debunk, and the title of this article is the myth regarding it being leaked from a lab. It literally makes no sense to present this argument. And lastly, point 4, the Wuhan lab has the same safety protocols as safety labs in America and Europe. Holy smokes, they just keep getting better. Oh, that proves it. They've got the same safety protocols. Whether they follow or not, who knows? But the same safety protocols. That means there's no way it could have come from a lab. I mean, this is enough to make someone speechless. And what I'll tell you is that these are the same arguments, and I invite you to go do your research, because every single debunk article comes back to these same 4 quasi-facts, weird things that have nothing to do with the evidence they're trying to go against. So I invite you to seek and find any and all of these debunk articles, chew on their arguments for a while, and why don't you let me know how it tastes. So this brings us all the way around to fact number 16, which I think really pulls this all home. And that is fact number 16. After the leak from the lab became public in China, the government held a meeting, an internal meeting, to increase security standards in its labs, then proceeded to shut down their labs and disallow any foreigners from gaining any access. So we can see here an article from the New York Post basically saying don't buy the Chinese story. And the article goes on to read, and I put this up for you so you can check it out. At an emergency meeting in Beijing held last Friday, Chinese leader Xi Jinping spoke about the need to contain coronavirus and set up a system to prevent similar epidemics in the future. A national system to control biosecurity risks must be put into place to protect the people's health, Xi said, because lab safety is a national security issue. Xi didn't actually admit that the coronavirus, now devastating large swaths of China, had escaped from one of the country's bioresearch labs. But the very next day, evidence emerged suggesting that it is exactly what happened, as the Chinese Ministry of Science and Technology released a new directive titled Instructions on Strengthening Biosecurity Management in Microbiology Labs that Handle Advanced Viruses like the Novel Coronavirus. I mean, does that not say it all? And from there, we go on to read article after article about how they disposed of the evidence that they had in the lab, which I showed you earlier, and how they're shutting down the lab to all foreigners and no one gets access. Again, so if this isn't the final convincer, I mean, I don't know what it will take. I mean, first you would figure that this event, if it was naturally occurring and started in a wet market, that the top lab in all of China studying this type of virus would be called on immediately to figure out the best way to combat the virus and share it with the world. Now, in fact, it was called on to destroy all its samples and hide from the world. But that's not what, obviously that's not what happened. What they did is immediately send out a bulletin basically saying you better tighten up your ship, and then proceeded to close down the lab to all foreigners and shred every bit of evidence that had them studying the virus. Now, in what world does this make sense to you? Like, what would lead to that set of facts? I mean, I simply ask you to look at the facts in front of you. If you still believe the propaganda from our mainstream media and the global scientific community that this pandemic occurred naturally in a wet market, then I ask you to please join those that believe it was created by 5G cell towers. And I also just want to add another word just to show you how the media, general science, the global scientific community, and all the mass media are really working against the truth. And it's funny because when I first started doing this about 3 weeks ago, there was an article called "The Coronavirus Did Not Escape from a Lab. Here's How We Know." And then the persistent myth can be put to bed. Well, after a couple of weeks, they actually changed the title without any credit toward editing. Like, in other words, no mistake here. They then retitled it, the coronavirus was not engineered in a lab. Here's how we know. The persistent myth can be put to bed. And when you go through these articles, actually it's the same exact article, it just does nothing, and I've shown you what their arguments were. But just how pathetic is it that they, weeks later, keep the same article up and change the title? And furthermore, and the most hilarious, poignant thing here, where we know they're all doing the bait and switch, right? We say it escaped from a lab, and they say, no, it wasn't bioengineered. You know, it's like, we didn't ask that question. We're not claiming that, right? I mean, could be the case, absolutely could be the case that it was bioengineered. But the claim is simply that this was leaked from a lab, bioengineered or not. And here we have editor's note on that same article that they changed the heading. On April 16th, news came out that the U.S. government said it was investigating the possibility that the novel coronavirus, I always say the canola virus, so the novel coronavirus may have somehow escaped from a lab, though experts still think the possibility that it was engineered is unlikely. What does one have to do with the other? What does the fact that it escaped from a lab have to do with the fact that it is engineered? Stop. When we say it was leaked, stop saying, no, it didn't come from a lab. It was not engineered. It just makes no sense. And that's all I got. So I'd like to thank you now for bearing with me throughout this video. I'm new to this, so my editing skills leave much to be desired, as you sure can tell. And also, you know that YouTube is not keen on this type of content, so this video will never show up on someone's recommended feed or list. Because of this, I encourage you to please like, subscribe, and share this video. I'd love to keep making new content as well. If you have an opinion, I'd really love to hear it. You know, in the comments section, please let your thoughts be known. And like I said, that's all I got, and hopefully you'll hear from me soon.
The Chinese government is to be congratulated for the extraordinary measures it has taken to contain the outbreak. I will praise China again and again.
From the very beginning, throughout December, it was spreading, and we now know it was spreading human to human. But the official line of the Chinese government was that this was all related to an animal market, and once they closed the market, it would all go away.
Did they know differently at that time?
Absolutely.